I ought to do my duty now and get us started. I am just delighted to see so many folks here. My name is Andy Davies. I'm the research director at the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center at Southern Methodist University, headquartered in Dallas, Texas. And we're here today to have a session for the next 90 minutes on the theme Research, Innovation in Action, Rural Criminal Practice. We are really honored to have with us an outstanding panel here today. First of all, we have Dr. Kevin Scott, who's the acting director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is the statistical agency within the Department of Justice. He has, since joining BJS in 2017, Dr. Scott has served as the unit chief for the Judicial Statistics Unit, collecting data on various aspects of the legal system, including the judiciary, prosecution, and indigent defense systems. And he is presently acting director of the agency. He'll, in a moment, be talking about the BJS's efforts to gather data on court systems and prosecution offices and indigent defense systems, particularly focusing on the challenges of doing that for rural places. We're also honored to be joined by Christian Mash. He's the state's attorney for Garrett County, Maryland, and has been since January 2023. Prior to his appointment there, he was an assistant state's attorney for about 10 years. And he will be talking about the experience as a prosecutor working in a rural county, which I'm sure he'll describe for us, and the way that he responds to data requests when he receives them and the kinds of challenges that can provide. We're also joined by Melissa Mackey. She's the Director of Research at the New York State Office of Indigent Legal Services. Director Mackey is responsible for creating a research agenda that unifies the agency's research interests and data reporting requirements, and is in the interesting position of having overseen for the last several years a program of enhancements to data reporting, both requirements but also infrastructure at the local level, including in rural counties across the state of New York. And last but not least, we're joined by Director Kristen Staley, who's the Executive Director of the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission. In her role, Director Staley is responsible for developing, implementing, and enforcing minimum standards for public defense statewide in Michigan. Our theme today is about the collection of data from rural court systems, as I said, not just courts, but also prosecution and defense offices. And all of us in various ways have attempted to do this and also face challenges doing this, but also the people in this room are uniquely positioned to talk about solutions and overcoming those challenges. What I want to do first, please, is I'll transition to Dr. Scott, Interim Director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, who will talk about his efforts in the agency to collect data on court systems around the country, but particularly the challenges of doing so in rural areas. And after Dr. Scott has finished speaking, I will be addressing to Dr. Scott any questions that you, the audience, might choose to put into the chat. Please do put questions into the chat as they occur to you. We have somebody on staff here who will be reviewing those questions, and we will try and collate them. And in a few minutes after Dr. Scott has finished speaking, we'll address to him some audience questions. What we shall do after that is segue into a broader conversation involving all of our panelists and their experience producing or requesting or analyzing data on rural criminal practice from where they are situated. And that will take us through to approximately 3:30 Eastern Time. So thank you again for joining us, and please do, as questions occur to you, put them in the chat. We will review them and we will ask them to Dr. Scott. But with that, I'd like to transition to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you to you and to the Deason Center for having me this afternoon. I want to explain that I am not in the Federal Witness Protection Program. The office that I currently sit in is not designed for the optimized for Zoom. So it's a beautiful sunny afternoon here in Washington, D.C., which means that the blinds that were put in 2010 or whatever aren't keeping the sun out. So you get to see a silhouette of me, but trust that this is not an AI, but actually me talking this afternoon. And I'm happy to kind of try to prove that maybe later in the talk. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and I make sure my presentation is advancing, is one of 13 federal statistical agencies spread across kind of the federal government, and is the one that is housed in the Department of Justice. And our statutory kind of requirement, or our obligation, or our mission, is to collect, analyze, publish, and disseminate information not just on crime. Oh, thank you. Now, thank you for that comment. I appreciate it. I was sharing it earlier and then turned it off. All right. So BJS, one of 13 principal federal statistical agencies, we're the federal statistical agency housed inside the Department of Justice. Our responsibility is to collect, analyze, publish, and disseminate the information not just on crime, but on every aspect of the criminal justice system at all levels of the government. We also do provide some financial and technical support to state, local, and tribal governments, in part to improve statistical capabilities, but we also have some statistical responsibility for supporting states as they try to improve their criminal history record data quality. At BJS, we like to, let's see if I get this right, we have what we call the funnel of crime, which I think is relatively common, but we like to overlay the funnel of crime with our data collections, of which there are nearly 50. And so our kind of signature data collection, or we start our data collections at kind of the moment of whether or not a crime occurs with the National Crime Victimization Survey. Then we follow information about crime in the criminal justice system all the way through the system to the reporting of crime to the authorities, to the decision whether or not the arrest or non-arrest of an individual for responsibility for the crime, and then the decision to prosecute, the decision to indict, and the adjudication and then sentencing of those individuals. And so as the funnel narrows, the number of people involved narrows, but the number of data collections that we have kind of targeted to the different stages of the criminal justice system doesn't necessarily decrease as you move through the criminal justice system. I would say that we have we are nearing, from our perspective, nearing the end of a period where we've struggled to collect good data about the adjudication phase of the criminal justice system. We've been investing in efforts to kind of improve those data collections for the past 5 or 6 years now. And we see the fruits of those, and we hope that publicly available information on the adjudication phase of the criminal justice system is more readily available from us in the near future. And I don't want to say hope, we will have data that's kind of covers some of these historical gaps in our coverage. Those data will be forthcoming within the next year or so. When we survey criminal justice, the criminal justice landscape, there are kind of 2 approaches to doing it. One approach is to conduct a census, which is to talk to everyone. And when we conduct censuses, we have much stronger coverage of criminal justice in the rural context. Like probably many other things, the number of governments that oversee there are a small number of governments that oversee a large number of people in this country, and then there is a large number of governments that oversee a small number of people in this country. And when we conduct a census, we talk to all of those governments. We talk to all of the victim service providers, many of which, by the way, are non-governmental. We talk to all of the state and local law enforcement agencies, all of the medical examiners, the coroners, the forensic crime laboratories. We talk to all of the district attorney's offices and all of the public defense providers. We talk to all of the jails, all of the prisons, all of the probation and parole systems. And we also talk, whenever we kind of try to collect data from tribal governments, we collect data from all of them all of the time, because there's a smaller number of governments. It's a more finite universe. Our censuses are, we think, much better at providing detailed data on rural criminal justice, because we're making that effort to effectively enumerate all the law enforcement agencies, or all of the jails, or all of the forensic crime laboratories. It doesn't matter how big the agency is. We want to know everything that we can about that agency. And so we invest the effort pretty frequently in all of our data collections to try to conduct that census, that is, to enumerate, to understand the kind of basic functions, basic resources available to, and basic work of all of the prosecutors' offices or public defense offices, no matter if there are many coroners in the country who are part-time, they're not even full-time, or district attorneys whose jobs are, that's not their full-time job. And when we're doing a census, that doesn't matter. And so we have the opportunity to talk to the rural criminal justice agencies and to talk to the very diverse set of agencies that we're interacting with when we conduct those data collections. We can't always conduct censuses. We can't always talk to everybody. And so we sample, because we're statisticians. We try to figure out a way to balance that trade-off between the number of people that we're talking to and our ability to talk about what's happening at the national level. When we conduct sample-based surveys, the focus of most sample-based surveys are larger governments, our larger counties, our larger cities, our larger judicial districts, more populous judicial districts. When we're looking to kind of conduct a sample survey, it is more likely that we'll focus our attention on the larger, because if we're thinking about kind of our population, trying to maximize our population coverage, and to make national claims, not regional claims, those claims will focus on talking to the largest agencies, and we will attempt to reach out to a sample of the smallest agencies. But because there are so many, fewer of those agencies are selected in the sample as a proportion of the total than are in more populous parts of the country. So our sample-based surveys are not, we will conduct outreach to, and we will try to talk to as many rural criminal justice agencies as we possibly can, but we'll have sampled a relatively smaller number of those agencies than we do when we're doing a census. We're not talking to everybody. We're trying to talk to a sample of agencies and trying to generalize from that sample to the entire country. And there are trade-offs there, but there are resource constraints that kind of necessitate that. Further, we know that if we want to learn a little bit more in depth, we're going to ask, when we conduct a census, we will ask a very few certain number of basic questions. But if we want more detailed understanding of law enforcement agencies or of the operations of courts or public defense providers, or prosecutors, if we want to ask a lot of questions, we're not going to ask that of all 3,000 of them. We'll ask that of a sample of 700 or so, depending on what the unit of analysis is. And it varies. There are 3,000 counties roughly in the country, and so there are roughly 3,000 district attorneys' offices. So obviously there are some states with multi-county district attorneys' offices, or they're structured by judicial districts. But for comparison, there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country, state and local law enforcement agencies in this country, and we'd love to talk to all 18,000 of them, but not all 18,000 want to talk to us, and not all, just as a matter of kind of thinking about resource investment with a finite set of resources, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the optimal number of those agencies to ask to complete our surveys? I want to speak briefly about kind of what we're doing when we're trying to collect data on judicial statistics on the adjudication process. And I said kind of at a couple of slides ago that this is something that we haven't done as successfully and as consistently as we have in other parts of the criminal justice system. I would say that BJS's two kind of real strengths are the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a national household-based survey to ask people about their experiences with victimization of crime. And we traditionally have really good data from correctional institutions. So we see people, once they've already been, the crime has been reported, they've been arrested, the crime has been adjudicated, and they've been sentenced to some sort of incarceration. And so that's certainly an important part of our criminal justice system, but understanding how those people get there, and the kind of filtering process where people end up incarcerated as opposed to, say, acquitted or not incarcerated, convicted, but not necessarily incarcerated, we don't have as good of an insight into. And so we've been investing for about 5 years now in trying to collect data with a more discrete focus on courts. And there's an audience out there, and so I know she's there. I want to do a real tip of the hat to my colleague Suzanne Strong, who has been a outspoken advocate of BJS for really investing in courts data collections for as long as she has been at BJS. And finally one day we all started listening to Suzanne, and we've been the better for it. And hopefully the data that comes as a result of our work together is data that's useful to as broad of an audience as possible. And so I appreciate kind of Suzanne's commitment to this against occasionally some difficult headwinds in terms of kind of resource constraints on the federal government side. Our one ongoing kind of data collection that we have recently completed, we conducted a survey in early 2021, which turned out to be a kind of difficult time to ask prosecutors' offices to sit down and take some time to answer some questions about their workload and their work as they were kind of coming off of COVID and kind of facing a significant case backlog. But we did complete that round of the National Survey of Prosecutors. We've been trying to do that periodically since 1990. We have one most recent round of data that we expect to release in the near future. And for that survey, we talk to prosecutors' offices, usually district attorneys, but in Maryland, for example, state's attorneys. So we're talking to those offices on a regular basis, and that's an ongoing data collection. And so some of the things that we're seeing in our 2021 data collection, we can look back 30 years earlier and start to make some comparisons about staffing in those offices and those kinds of things. We have also, with not as much frequency, I would say, tried to conduct a census of the public defense providers in the United States. And we did that in 2007. We did it again, I might get my date wrong, in 2012. And we're underway with our next, we should not have waited a decade, but we're underway with our next census of public defender offices. And we're really interested in seeing kind of how the landscape of public defense, how many people are working in public defense, what those caseloads look like, what the resources look like in terms of kind of litigation support for public defense providers, what those things look like on a national basis. And that is something that we're trying to get through our census of public defender offices. A project that kind of has been boiling at BJS and that BJS has worked with Andy on and is continuing to work with Andy on is the survey of public defenders, where we concluded a while ago that talking to offices as your kind of, what we would call your respondent, your level of respondent, doesn't necessarily tell us much about what happens inside the office. And so we wanted to try to see if we could survey individual public defenders. We did a small pilot study of this a couple of years ago, and I think that we're optimistic that if we were to put this at the national level, that we would be able to do so relatively effectively. And so that was a really kind of an interesting study. We got a really strong response rate from individual public defenders and a lot of cooperation from their offices to help us figure out who to contact for that survey. So it was a really interesting project, and one that you should see more from at BJS. And we're asking, in that survey, we're asking individual public defenders a little bit about their background, a little bit how long they've worked at their office, how long they think they'll continue to be at their office, on trying to understand the kind of resources they have, trying to understand a little bit about their caseload and the individual cases that they are trying to kind of balance as they kind of play that key role in the criminal justice system, but also to understand kind of the stressors, right? The kind of things that kind of weigh on them. We have a question about how much student loan debt they have, because we're curious. That certainly drives, I think, people's ability to participate in public defense or to stay in the public defense field. If that's something that they, kind of hangs over them perpetually, and there's no relief from that, then they may maybe choose to choose a profession that maybe compensates them a little bit better financially just to deal with that debt rather than the profession that they would prefer to be in. So understanding kind of the thought process of those people who are public defenders, I think, is something that hopefully we get some really interesting results of. I'm confident that we will. We have two data collections that are effectively administrative data collections from courts. We're trying to see cases from filing to termination. One project that we've been working on for about 4 years to try to basically get administrative data from states and from counties about the cases that they're processing, just asking basically courts for data extracts and trying to harmonize those data extracts to kind of produce a national picture of what courts do. And then we have what we call the National Pretrial Reporting Program, where we're trying to take some of that court data and we're trying to link it to data provided to us by jails and by pretrial service agencies, so that we can better understand some of the decisions about bail, pretrial incarceration, and the impact of some of those decisions on later adjudication. So to begin to kind of understand the integrated nature of the criminal justice process using administrative data. And then finally, we have, I think, a really interesting project where we're just trying to enumerate the state courts out there. And we're working on this with the National Center for State Courts. I think it's a really interesting project, but it's the basic question of kind of what is a court is a question that you may have in your mind what a court looks like. But is that court, is that court a motor home that goes across a series of counties to kind of handle small claims issues? Does that count as a court? Because if your definition of court is something related to a courthouse, then something that's mobile might not. So trying to think through what a court is and how many people are working in those courts and the diversity of the jurisdiction in those courts, particularly limited jurisdiction and municipal courts across the country is something that we're particularly interested in. And we think can kind of shed light on the lower profile nature of both the civil and criminal justice systems. All right, so I always do this. I always talk about one slide and then ahead of actually turning to that slide. So this is the slide that I should have been on when I was talking about some of those programs. When we're talking about our work with rural areas, like I said at the outset, when we conduct a census, those censuses will talk to all of the courts. We're going to find all the courts in the country. We want to talk to all of them. We want to find all the public defender offices and all the prosecutor offices in the country, and we want to talk to them. We want to get kind of the basic data of what they're all doing, just really basic information on the work that they're encountering, and that means that we're able to talk meaningfully, not just about the national picture, but about the variation. And here I mean the variation not necessarily just between urban, suburban, and rural, but ideally the variation between what's happening in rural counties in Texas and what's happening in rural counties in Georgia. Because that's where I think, kind of talking about rural areas and just kind of lumping them all together, I don't think anybody particularly in this webinar is particularly interested in that. So understanding the kind of variation, the nuance kind of across, rural justice and what rural justice means. And there are parts of, rural America that are pretty sparsely populated, and there are parts of rural America that are really sparsely populated. And understanding how justice can be provided in those two different contexts and how it might vary is, I think, one of the things that we would like to be able to kind of contribute to with our censuses. The future efforts, I've talked about the survey of public defenders that will reach out to public defenders in urban jurisdictions, in suburban jurisdictions, and in rural jurisdictions when we do that survey. And we're also, I think, trying to find our way through, our focus is, we're thinking about kind of the primary focus of our data collections, particularly in courts. We're primarily interested in felony adjudication, but we understand, and I think everyone does, that there's in terms of volume, misdemeanor adjudication and the adjudication of those kinds of offenses far outpaces the kind of incidence of felonies in this country. And the consequences in misdemeanor adjudication can be significant, just as those can be in felony adjudication. So I think understanding speaking about the work of public defenders, of prosecutors as well in this context, how much are they doing that's felony work and how much of the work that they're doing is misdemeanor work. And so understanding those distinctions is something that we're kind of continuing to develop our ability to collect those data. From a statistician's perspective, there are, I think, some challenges as we try to collect data from rural areas. Generally speaking, our response rates from rural jurisdictions tend to be somewhat lower than our response rates from larger, more urban jurisdictions. And this can be shown in both our National Survey of Prosecutors and our National Survey of Indigent Defense Providers, which we last did about 10 years ago. We think there are kind of a series of concerns. The first is that if you're a small office, if you've got one or two or half or a person in your office and you're getting a survey response and it takes you an hour to do it, that's a much bigger percentage of your day than it is an office that has 2,000 employees and probably has somebody who sits in a data warehouse and can pull all the data to answer all of the questions. So as a percentage of kind of the total available time in a given day, for a smaller office, our surveys are naturally a greater burden. And so we are trying, not always successfully, obviously, to kind of keep an eye on that burden. We also understand that, in the kind of rural justice context, people play multiple roles. And those roles are not entirely governmental. People may be part-time, the county prosecutor, and part-time have a private practice. And so, to which job, and where does a responding to a survey kind of fit in that is a difficult challenge. And then when we're asking questions about caseload or about staffing or about salary, those are questions that are data intensive, resource intensive questions. And if you've got a big kind of database of all of your cases or a case management system, querying that system is relatively straightforward. You're probably accustomed to doing that. But if you don't have that kind of big case management system in front of you, or the big payroll system in front of you, or your county does the payroll for your office and every other office at the same time, and you have to call that person and they've got 17 other data requests in front of them, we understand that those are kind of burdens that everybody faces. And so I think that from our perspective, and none of these are silver bullets, but to better understand kind of rural criminal justice, there are, I think, three things that we see. The first is we're trying to reduce our survey burden. We're trying to make things as easy to do as possible. And that can include something as straightforward as providing people with a paper copy of a survey. And that has, I think, two advantages. One is that, a web form doesn't necessarily work particularly well if you don't have the latest and greatest PC right in front of you sitting on your desk. But also, if you've got three people that you need to help answer questions, if you've got a paper copy you can pass around, we're hopeful that paper copy can walk its way around your office. And your payroll person can answer the question about how many people you have working, and your budget person, who may or may not be a separate person, can answer the question about how big your budget is. And a paper copy makes that a little bit easier. We also do targeted outreach, which is to say that we're trying to partner with organizations that have a good working relationships with the rural criminal justice providers. But I think we're also, and part of the reason I'm here is we're interested to hear kind of what are we not thinking of? What am I sitting in Washington, D.C. not thinking of that will help get me an answer from Plainview, Texas? Because that's a question that's difficult, I think, for me to kind of put myself in the shoes and for us to put ourselves in our shoes. And we can try to kind of reach out specifically to people who provide criminal justice in rural communities and ask them to kind of sit with us and talk through with us, and we'll absolutely listen. But we're certainly, even then, we can only listen to a small number of people. So webinars like this, which let us reach a much broader audience, I think are a wonderful opportunity for us. And so we're interested to hear kind of some of the comments and some of the thoughts that people might have along those lines. And hopefully that will also come out of the conversation later this afternoon. All right, my last slide. I love this slide in part because it's so busy, but the idea behind this slide is basically just to tell you that you can find us. We have a website, bjs.ojp.gov. I guess now you call it X, so I guess we should say that. Our X is bjs.gov. We don't do Blue Sky or anything, Threads or anything of that just yet, but we do have a Facebook page, we have a YouTube page. So if you probably enter the Bureau of Justice Statistics into Google, you hopefully will end up with us. One thing I do want to say is that we've got, if you find yourself to our webpage, you'll get a little pop-up that says stay in touch. And what I want to do is encourage you to fill out that so that you can kind of start to get information from us and see what we're doing. And that will also give you a way to get back in touch with us. And I am, of course, happy to provide my personal email address. I will tell you that it's not kevin.scott@usdoj.gov. That's a deputy U.S. Marshal somewhere in Miami. But my favorite thing about BJS, and I think several people have heard me say this before, is that we have an email address, and it's askbjs@usdoj.gov, and that really does get you to our staff. Our statisticians answer questions that go to that email address. So if you have questions about what we're up to, if you have questions about locating a report, or interpreting a table, or trying to find a data set for something that you're working on, you email that address, and a statistician or another one of our staff will absolutely get back to you with what is the correct answer. What is the correct answer, I will say. Right. So again, I want to say thank you to Andy and to the Deason Center. I look forward to the conversation with my fellow panelists, and I'm happy to answer questions as a prelude to that, I guess.
Thank you so much, Kevin. We will be moving into a conversation directed exactly, I hope, in the way that you were indicating, towards solutions for increasing response rates and things like that. We will really try to wrap things together at the end by returning to that question. Before we do that, and in fact, before we engage other panelists, I do just want to pass on a couple of questions that did come in. The first is to say, Kevin, that an attendee noticed that the last national survey prosecutors was conducted in 2007, similar with the last census of state courts. And their question is, what are some resources that enable BJS to bring these surveys back? And what's the Bureau's plan to sustain the surveys in the future?
Sure. So let's talk about prosecutors first, and then I'll talk about courts. I think that for good or ill, the people who have worked at BJS over the past, over its entire history, I think, are kind of faced with a calculation about how do we get the most coverage given our limited resources. And I think that I'm not sure that I agree with this assessment, but I think that a kind of decision has been made somewhere along the way that in the middle, late aughts and the early tens, I guess teens, tens, there were kind of decisions like we were collecting data about court cases in particular by sending people to courts and having them look at physical case files. And that made sense in 1987. That didn't make maybe as much sense in 2007. And I think that it meant that we would have to invest in figuring out how to get data extracts. And not necessarily all courts in 2007 could have provided us data extracts. And so I think that some of it is kind of figuring out how to do things in a cost-effective manner. That's kind of understanding that we owe an obligation to the taxpayer. What are we doing that kind of gives them the best value for their tax dollar? And I think that the other part of that is kind of a sustained attention to paying attention to kind of prosecutors and to state courts. And I think that in the case of prosecutors in particular, we made some mistakes. I think we were trying to get all prosecutors' offices to do a pretty complex survey, and it didn't go well. And we didn't kind of take a step back and regroup and say, okay, let's figure out a way to move forward. So we did that, and we did successfully conduct a survey in 2021, and those data will be out. So the prosecutor's office's data, we will have more current data on that in the near future. And as long as I'm working here, we're going to continue to survey prosecutors' officers and public defense providers. I'm not saying lobby anybody to try to keep me in my job, but I think that I think there's an acknowledgement across BJS that this is an important audience for us. And I think that we, in kind of context of courts, what we were doing before was effectively what we called at the time state court organization. And in all candor, the National Center for State Courts has done a great job in the interim of kind of keeping a lot of those data elements collected that were in that original data collection. And we're now back at a point now where, partnering with the National Center, we think that there's kind of a key set of data elements that we were collecting 16 years ago that we still want to collect, that they're still collecting. But we think there's additional information, particularly, I said, about limited jurisdiction and municipal courts, that I think that we can add to that. And that's what I think we're going to try to do. So I think part of this is understanding how courts have evolved in the time, and understanding how BJS can serve the data needs of the court and the adjudication community is something that we just kind of need to keep focused on. And so it's a very long answer to say, hold our feet to the fire.
Thank you, Kevin. And actually, one other question that came through directly to me that I don't think the audience will have seen, but people are always welcome to sort of DM me with questions. You mentioned that your response rates on survey and census work in rural places tend to be generally lower, but you also referenced one project that was an attempt to extract administrative data, which I take it is a different kind of a data collection activity. And the question was, do you see similarly a lack of administrative data or a lack of capability to supply it to you anyway when you're going to rural places?
I think that at the highest level, I think that the answer is yes. And I think that that's because I should say that we are most successful in collecting administrative data when there's already a statewide data source that is collecting it from all the courts in that state. Or there's a unified kind of public defense system where there's a strong kind of central community. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's a rural versus urban divide in that context. I think it's a strong state system versus kind of county-based or judicial district or multi-county based system where it's a little bit more fragmented at the state level. It's a lot more difficult for us, even if we're taking only a sample of states. Those states are a sample of counties in some of those states. Counties are not as kind of accustomed to dealing maybe with us as states are kind of accustomed to dealing with these data requests. So it's this weird kind of not necessarily urban versus it's to our advantage when we can collect those data from states that have a good mix between kind of urban and rural communities. So North Carolina has really great court data, which means that we get to see kind of across the array of the urban, suburban, and rural jurisdictions inside North Carolina, we get really good data. Whereas there are some other states, California doesn't have really kind of strong central databases, at least in the court system. And so while it's large and populous or has very many large and populous cities, we don't have good insight into what's happening in the state of California because there's not a statewide database that we can kind of work with.
Thank you. Appreciate that very much. I do want to, and thank you, Kevin, for an awesome presentation. I do want to now bring in a couple of our other panelists. And having started with you, Kevin, at the kind of apex of the federal government, at least as far as justice statistics is concerned, I'd like to go directly to you, Kristen. Kristen, you're a prosecutor in Western Maryland. I wonder if you would mind, first of all, describing your county and where it is that you're actually working, but then also tell us a little bit about the kind of data demands that are routinely placed on your office. What is it that you have to collect because you have to report it out every year?
Sure. So I am the chief prosecutor in Maryland's westernmost county. We're well within the Appalachian region. So a little different than most of the what you typically think about as Maryland, which is a metropolitan or suburban kind of county. It's the least densely populated county in the state. We have recently been able to get funding for a third full-time prosecutor. That's inclusive of myself. So the smallest prosecutor's office in the state. We don't have really the luxury, and this is, I think, common in rural offices across the country. We don't have the luxury, of course, of being able to really specialize. We have to be able to do every sort of case, from sexual assault cases, misdemeanor court, every manner of case. As far as the data collection, a lot of the data collection demands that we're required to do in this jurisdiction, and obviously this varies depending on the state, but the state of Maryland has, as Director Scott had alluded to, there's a statewide system where the courts are requiring, through the Sentencing Commission, collection of certain data. Now that's limited to felonies and misdemeanor cases in which a pre-sentence investigation is ordered. So generally just limited to felonies. But there's a lot of input of data elements through that system. Typically, the prosecutor who's handling the case is creating and inputting those sentencing guideline worksheets. That includes, for example, a lot of demographic data on the defendant, the nature of their representation, whether it's a public defender or private counsel, the unrepresented people to the extent that that happens. So a lot of those data entry points are going through a centralized portal that Maryland changes and has different sort of acronyms every 2 years for these agencies, but I just call it the Sentencing Commission. So they're collecting as a part of an ongoing process, and the folks that monitor that in College Park will routinely reach out monthly to ensure compliance, so that they get, I believe, a pretty high response rate from all the different jurisdictions. That would be the main input in terms of what's a statewide required disclosure in terms of data, and that's just on an ongoing basis as part of each case. So that would be the number one current demand. There have been proposals, and I think we'll probably get to that later, but there have been some proposals in Maryland, and I know in other places, to mandate or require a lot more intensive data collection of different data elements, maybe at the time while you're in court and not as part of a sentencing function. But I think that probably would be non-responsive to your question. So the main way that it's collected is through a statewide portal that is submitted through the sentencing guidelines.
I appreciate the segue there, Christian, because I did want to ask about that. I know that there are instances where either some new entity might come in and ask for new data, or there are lots of circumstances where either on an ad hoc or due to a sort of statutory change, some sort of basis, you would potentially suddenly be required to produce more information. Are you able to share with us any stories of what that looks like, or what the prospect of a new data demand, what the implications would be for a 2 but almost recently 3-person office?
Right, they would be significant demands, and I, just speaking broadly, at the risk of sounding sort of obstructionist, I think data is a fantastic thing for the criminal justice system and for law enforcement and prosecutors. We've seen, and this is, you can debate the causes, but not the trend, that there is a decrease in trust and confidence in the criminal justice system broadly in the past, let's say, decade. And I believe that when we are able to collect and look at data, we can really talk about transparency about the good work that's being done in the criminal justice system. There will always be a new true crime podcast or a documentary talking about corruption or a tragic or unjust circumstance. But I do believe in the criminal justice system, and I think that to the extent that we're able to gather more data from rural jurisdictions, we can increase the public's confidence in that. Now, when I say that, I don't want to sound obstructionist. That's because there are constraints, and I think everybody here is probably aware of them generally. But a small jurisdiction such as mine does not have the economy of scale of a jurisdiction, say in the greater Baltimore metropolitan area. So that when you place intensive demands, data collection demands on somebody in that office, you're really looking at a system where you're wearing many different hats. You're working everything with victim witness contact every day, doing the normal nuts and bolts things of your office, and then also any administrative requirements you have. When you add intensive data collection requirements to a small rural prosecutor's office, what you're really doing is you're creating a financial impact, because likely, of course, you have data management sort of software that you need to comply. You also need a person to be able to input that data, whether or not that is somebody like a support staff, or whether or not you're really required to have someone almost like a scribe, so to speak, who's going to look at each individual characteristic or data element that's required. Maryland, largely in response to some of the tragic police-involved fatalities that we've seen in recent years, there had been a proposal to really broadly increase the data collection required by local prosecutors' offices. And while I understand the public sentiment to want that data, I understand the reaction. I just urge people to sort of tap the brakes and thoughtfully evaluate who's paying for this, how is that data being collected, is it being collected in a way we can really do it consistently across jurisdictions? Just to touch on that, I don't believe that really if we're gonna have meaningful data sets, and you're the statistical people, so you would know better than I, but if we're gonna have meaningful data sets, they need to be implemented and collected consistently. And so if you're thinking that it's going to be implemented consistently in a small county that has a shoestring budget and has very limited personnel, it's just not the reality. It's not going to be consistently collected. So if we're thoughtful about the data elements and we're saying, okay, what's the utility of this data element versus what's the burden of collection, I think you're more likely, number one, to have a response and compliance, but number two, you're also going to collect that data consistently, hopefully. So I think that those are some of the concerns. The financial concern, is your funding entity able to do that? And are you logistically able to hire and retain the people to be able to do that? So those are some of the it would be a significant burden on, I believe, most rural prosecutors' offices, which is why I believe that it generally would be better implemented at a statewide level, collecting that data through, in Maryland, the Administrative Office of the Courts, or some statewide agency, so that we, number one, can consistently do it, and we can have it funded across the different jurisdictions.
Thank you for that, Christian. And I want to perhaps bring in Melissa now, if I may. And the reason I'd like to ask you, Melissa, and perhaps Kristen, you would have a response to this as well. But Christian, speaking from the point of view of a person working in a county government, and I think it's worth pointing out that unlike a lot of the other kinds of criminal justice entities that Kevin was referring to, law enforcement and so on, courts, prosecutors, and indigent defense are very commonly organized at the county level. They're this isn't universally true, but for this sector of the criminal justice system, you very often have county governments in charge. And counties, it seems to me, are sort of distinctive entities. Unlike a municipal government, where by definition everything is reasonably urban, counties almost always have a mixture of urban centers that may be large or small, and usually rural areas as well. So asking county governments to be in charge of anything is almost always asking places that are quite disparate in the sort of composition that they have and the sort of resources that are available to them. And I've been wondering a little bit whether the fact that courts are so often organized at the county level makes these differences between rural and urban and the challenges more obvious. But I'm interested, Melissa, for you and in your experience, what do you notice about Christian's experience that is resonating for you? Do you find that in the rural counties, the financial, the manpower, the labor market type characteristics are different in a way that impact on the data that you're able to collect?
So I absolutely do. I was nodding my head a lot when Christian was speaking. What we find in New York, we have a mix. When you say New York, people think New York City. But once you move out of New York City, you have varying estimates of the rurality of the state. Between 24 and 42 of our 62 counties would be considered rural. And you're absolutely right. On the other side of things, when you have small defender offices where there are only 3 full-time attorneys, there may not be a full-time administrative support person who will be able to effectuate the data collection and work with the attorneys to collect the information as it comes in from the court. And then when you go to larger jurisdictions, they have an entire data entry staff. And so they have a rigorous system whereby their attorneys go out to court for the day, they come back with their paper files, they drop them into a bin. The next data entry person pulls that out, they know what they're looking for, they know how to enter it into their case management system. And so they have already built an infrastructure to be able to collect that information. We also find the difference in urban and rural counties, or within the counties, I should say, the difference in the type of court. New York State has town and village courts, which are small justice courts. There are over 1,200 of them. And so in some of our counties, there does not exist a city court or a district court. District courts are only in Long Island, actually, in 2 of our counties. So we have these differing court systems also that impact the information that is coming back and the process and procedure for our defense organizations to find out the information. It might impact how attorneys are assigned to individual cases. As you were saying, Kristen, some of them have to be generalists in our smaller offices. And so we even have attorneys who are operating because of the size of the defense office. Attorneys are practicing in a city court, but they're also picking up a night court in one of the town and village where they're appearing there and they have clients there. So the process, the way the information is collected, the procedures by which they flow and information comes absolutely impact our ability to get the information that we're looking for.
Thank you. I wonder if, Kristen, I could ask you a very similar but related question. I wonder what your reflections would be on the differences that you see in rural places that you, in terms of their capacity to supply information to you, and if you have any particular solutions that you've been pursuing in Michigan that you maybe think have been promising.
Yeah, sure, of course. So just a little bit of a background in terms of the setup in terms of Michigan, and so our office, the Indigent Defense Commission, we're about 10 years old, just a little bit under 10 years, and prior to our state office existing, there was no state entity that was overseeing trial level public defense work in the state of Michigan. And so, as you said in my opening here, our office is responsible for creating a set of standards that are mandatory at the local level amongst our 83 counties, but also our district court levels as well. So that actually includes 133 local systems. So it's the trial court funding unit itself. So similar to the towns and the counties, we have what we call third-class district courts, which is a municipality. Our cities, so versus Detroit, the city of Detroit, versus Wayne County, the county itself. And so within our state, our state constitution does not allow unfunded mandates from the state into the county level, which comes with a lot of pluses and minuses that is a whole other panel to discuss. But when our office was created, and if we're going to the state is going to mandate at a local level to come into compliance and abide by a certain standard of delivering public defense, the state has to pay for those changes that the local level has to implement in order to come into the compliance with that mandate. And so our office, our commission, and our staff, we have a set of 9 standards that are very similar to what the ABA standards look like. A lot of other states also have IDCs like us. Texas, Utah, California that have something similar. New York, where you see statewide standards existing for the delivery of defense. But our office does not provide direct services, and so we actually fund the local units, and they can pick and choose about how they want to come into compliance with these standards. So some of our counties have public defense offices. Some of our counties utilize a managed assigned counsel roster with administrator. It really does just depend on the local choice. And it does differ, whether it's the rural area, where if we're talking about the Upper Peninsula, which is completely rural, we actually have quite a few public defender offices up there. Some are regionalized, some are public defense offices of 2 people, and in our more urban areas, we actually see a handful of places that just maintain a hybrid of a PD office, but then have a very robust managed design council roster. But with each one of these places, because we provide the state must pay for the compliance, so we provide funding in a vehicle of an annual grant. And so the local systems, 133 local systems, apply to us on our commission, tell us how they're going to comply. And with that grant, we provide the information. We provide the funding. But the give and take with a grant, just like all the rest of us who've dealt with grants, is that we also, with our grant contract, we require data reporting. And so we require to have quarterly reporting. It is based on our standards and the implementing on our standards. We have in our statute a requirement that local systems must participate in data collection. We have a great partnership with our state court administrative office because our office only oversees the indigent defense funding units. So that's really the municipalities, the counties. We do not oversee the courts. So we have a good cooperation and working relationship with the courts, but we can't mandate the courts to do anything. It's just the funding units themselves. And so it is a little tricky. But with that relationship of us having the purse and them having the information, and that's the cooperation, it really does help quite a bit. Now, it doesn't necessarily get rid of all the issues though, right? I think Kristen put it really well, and Melissa, you mentioned it as well. Sometimes money just isn't the answer. We really just need people, and a lot of the places, it's just a difficult time hiring folks, right? It's a difficult time keeping and retaining people to do these types of jobs. We understand. Kristen did a really great question about, unfortunately, we do have to have additional data points because we didn't unveil our standards all at once, because that would be like drinking out of a fire hose. So we tried to do it slowly, rolling them out over the past 10 years. But that meant each year we required a different data point to be collected because it was the fund based on the grant funding that was being provided. This year, for example, we have one of our new standards is about attorney pay rates and making sure that we're not disincentivizing the work. So that means we have to have a little bit more detailed information about making sure that the pay rates that attorneys are having, but also what does disincentivizing mean? And so our research department, which is a department of 2 people right now, we work with our local systems to figure that out and to change the grant reporting that we require. But we also know that this is a partnership. And so rather than just saying, hey, you have to go get us this information, we are dedicated to providing the technical assistance from my staff and from our office to go out into the field and actually say, hey, look, what can we do to make it happen for you so that we can get this information back? Nothing is perfect, but it's been successful so far. That's a big part of yes, we provide standards and enforce those standards, but we also want to make sure that everybody's actually able to get to that and we can track it well, because it benefits all of us when I have to go back to the state legislature and the appropriating bodies to say, hey, look, this is the transparency. This is the data we've been able to collect. Yes, it's slow to get to it, but think about the information we never had before. And so it's a cooperation. It takes time. It could be very slow and tedious, but I think the takeaway that I've seen in our state, that because it's a hybrid where we do have the state office, but it really is locally controlled in many ways, to ensure that fidelity with reporting and to ensure that we have enough capacity locally, we really do have to go out into the field and be present and to provide the technical assistance as much as possible, and to know that we're going to get it wrong, and to kind of brainstorm together on how to I don't know, figure out how are we going to collect the next set of data and that information, be creative.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm sitting with your observation that it's not just all about money. It seems to me a profound principle worthy of revisiting. I do want to come back to Kristen in a moment, but first I'd like to go to Melissa, if I may. Melissa, you're also in a state where you've, much like Kristen was referencing, you've had new funding to increase data and reporting. When we were preparing for this session, you reminded me of something which I sort of not thought about, but which Kristen's point that money might not solve everything could also speak to. At least in New York, but also in many places, indigent defense in rural places is often systematically differently organized, in that it is not provided by a public defender office, which could maintain a data system, but rather by something a little bit more ad hoc, where private lawyers are taking cases one at a time. And so another challenge that happens in rural areas is that there are just different systems in place that could possibly generate any data. And that might be another reason why just simply throwing money at the problem doesn't solve it. But I do wonder, how have you incentivized data collection from across New York? And I do wonder whether there have been particular sort of structural impediments in rural places that have made it difficult, even with an abundance of resources.
Right. So, Kristen, when you were speaking about the hybrid system and from the state, but it's really locally controlled, we recognize that. And you also talked about the purse strings, holding the purse strings and then requesting the data. Those two things go hand in hand. So in New York State, we've had two huge influxes of funding for criminal defense representation. First, through the Harrell Herring settlement, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And then also in 2017, the legislature expanded the Harrell Herring settlement requirements throughout the state. Along with that came $250 million for state expansion of the Harrell Herring settlement. And it was incremented. Again, we talk about incrementation of things. So 50 million one year, 100 million, 150. And we just recently reached the 5th year where the $250 million is being made available. With that money, we've done a number of different things to incentivize the collection of data. The budgets that the providers have available to them in the contracts. The contracts do require data collection, but the budgets allow for the acquisition of case management systems, the upgrading of their case management system if necessary. We also have funding lines where it's been indicated they don't have administrative support staff that would be able to do the data collection that would be necessary. So we've provided those resources too. We've also instituted something called a county data officer. And so for each of the counties outside of the 5 Harrell Herring counties and 1 for all of New York City, we have an ILS funded position whose purpose is to be a liaison between the research team and the other departments here at ILS and those who are doing the data collection and reporting at the county level. And so we've provided training to the data officers. We open up those trainings to anybody in the provider officers who are engaged in data entry, data collection, or data reporting. We've also done things, we invite the vendors of the case management systems that are currently being used. There are about 10 different systems. We invite them to our data collection, our data officer trainings, so that they're well aware of what our reporting requirements are, and they can work with the provider offices to tailor these systems to meet both our needs and the way in which the office is structured. So we've tried to do, and we also have an internal data officer. And that data officer is our liaison to work with all of them to provide the trainings and to be a resource anytime there's a new person who comes on in a data officer position, a new system, a new CMS that's being introduced. We've also done things like we work with provider offices if they reach out to us and say, we realize we can't collect everything that you're looking for. They report annually on the annual reporting form, the ILS 195. We want to update our intake form. Can you work with us? We want to update our arraignment cover sheet that we use on arraignments because there's a section on the form, the annual reporting, that asks about arraignments. We will work directly with them to update those data reporting forms. Now, we do all of those things, but in rural areas, the lift is a little bigger. In the rural areas, we have what we call, all of the counties have an assigned counsel program, and that's a panel of private attorneys who are assigned cases for those who are financially eligible to receive mandated representation. But we have 2 kinds of assigned counsel. We have managed assigned counsel programs, and we have unmanaged assigned counsel programs. We can work much more closely with our managed assigned counsel, and by that I mean there's an administrator. And so that administrator is responsible for the collection of the data and reaching out to the attorneys, et cetera. When it's an unmanaged system, we run into a little bit of something what I think Kristen was talking about, wearing many hats. In that instance, it's probably a county agency like the Department of Finance or even the county attorney who's working to collect the information for us. It's not their primary responsibility, and it's not going to be their primary task that they engage in every day. And so when the reports are due, we have to do a lot of follow-up to see if we can get complete and accurate information. And as always, in county offices and all offices, there's turnover. So the person we spoke to last year is not going to be the person who's going to be able to help us this year. So we just have to do a lot of continual outreach all year long to try to get this. The last main problem we have, whether it's managed or unmanaged, is by nature, the assigned counsel programs are decentralized. And so having someone whose responsibility it is to continually reach out, did you submit your voucher? Your voucher isn't complete. We don't have the information that we have to report to ILS, and that kind of follow-up, that can require a lot of time. And, you know, when you're trying to run the program, keep track of assignments, develop mentor programs, all of the other things you're trying to do to bring about better quality and a stronger infrastructure, data is going to fall lower and lower on that priority list. And it's understandable because you have clients to represent. You're trying to keep a program going. We have this very complex court system where you have city courts and town and village courts and a county court. And so we understand, and I know we're talking about criminal courts here, but in New York State, there is a broad mandate for representation of parents in family court matters, well beyond just the child abuse and neglect cases. And so we understand why data can fall lower and lower on the priority list. But I'll even say in instances when we're working with assigned counsel, our research team has gone out and coded the vouchers ourselves. If you will give us access to them, we will send someone out with a coding sheet to get as much information as we can. And as we've all talked about, implementation is incremental. We try to work with them. Can you add this? Can you add 2 more things? These are the things that we're missing. Is there another way that we can get this information? Is there another source for this information? And what we find is because the town and village courts are not under the authority of our state Office of Court Administration and the unified court system, we don't have the same level of data from the town and village courts that we would be able to get. So when we're talking about rural communities who might have a dozen, I think one of our counties has 29 town and village courts, we're not going to be able to look to the court system in those instances to get the information. We've got to work more closely with the providers in the county.
Thank you, Melissa. So I want to come back to Kristen then. Kristen, you've heard from these Melissa and Kristen, both in different ways, state level agencies that are overseeing the defense function. And I wonder, and both also making data demands at the same time as providing resources to people to increase their ability to provide data. But I do wonder about your perspective, again, as a county official. If somebody were to come to you in a hypothetical scenario and say, I'd like a lot more data, and I'll also provide all the resources that you need to hire the people and so on, does that entirely get you to where you would need to go? I mean, I recognize, for example, that you are working with the county government that will have to presumably sign off on whatever the plan is, that you may have questions beyond resources about the resources themselves wouldn't address. So I just wonder what problems do you face, even in the ideal resource-rich scenario, of being able to suddenly respond to new demands for data?
In a world where you know, there's endless money, and that's not an obstacle. I think generally I would be more inclined to want to voluntarily collect data, even just as an internal sort of control, to be able to publish that on a data dashboard, or to appropriately respond to like a Public Information Act request, something like that. It wouldn't be the sole obstacle, because you would still have, again, and I think the more rural you are, the more difficult it is to recruit and retain attorneys generally. And I think it goes for certain support staff as well. For example, we had difficulty recruiting people who had a good tech background in terms of the digital evidence management, body camera, redaction, things like that. And for whatever reason, a lot of professional people don't want to live in rural areas. So we've seen that sort of brain drain dynamic across the country. That would be an obstacle, but I don't think it would be universal that rural prosecutors would respond that way, and I certainly don't speak for everybody. But I personally would be inclined to say, let's collect that data so we can look at, for example, racial disparities or something like that. One, to increase public transparency and say, this is the information. We're not trying to hide anything. And number two, to the extent that there are that people in whatever sort of demographic element you're looking at are being treated differently, you want to know about it, you want to address it. And without the data, you're really relying on, just anecdotal evidence or narratives. So I would be inclined to collect it. The thing that I would maybe be resistant to would be, and again, this would have to be mandated, but with some of the proposals, you can come up with any sort of data metric to collect, right? And I would say you want to respect the privacy of victims when you're looking at victim data. There's a lot of mitigating or aggravating evidence that's based on the victim status, and there's somebody, the criminal justice system is focused on the defendant, of course, but we have to, number one, respect their privacy. Number two, there's a lot of charging decisions or declination decisions or plea decisions that live in this universe of subjective factors. There's an endless variety of mitigating or aggravating circumstances, and not everything can be a 0 or a 1 that's a data collection point. And I don't know that it's necessarily useful or helpful to require local offices to collect or make an attempt even to really objectify all information. So there are certain things that I think are inappropriate for data collection. Many might disagree, but I think that there's a lot of in the criminal justice system, there's so much subjectivity in certain factors that you can't always reduce everything to that data set.
I appreciate that, Christian. So we've got about just over 15 minutes left. Here's where I think we stand in asking the question about getting data from rural places, and implicitly also Kevin's question about kind of improving the ability to get responses to his projects. We've heard certain things that are needed. Some things are needed, like resources, like personnel, and finances to support the personnel. There are some questions about the technological capacities of rural places, but then also interesting discourses transacting that around, for example, statewide agencies that may happen to actually really have a good penetration of technology into rural places, pre-existing resources like unified court system data sets that happen to have a lot of useful data residing in them already. And Kevin, you raised the example of North Carolina. There are also some persistent and maybe slightly more evanescent cultural issues around things like resistance to collecting data. Christian, you said you couldn't speak for everybody, and I imagine you're perhaps thinking about other people who just have a different philosophy about this kind of thing than you might. But I really don't want to make any assumptions about what might be included in that bucket. And then very good point also about not simply collecting data for no purpose, not simply collecting data that might be even collected for a sort of an invidious purpose or something like that. So a lot of the dynamics that we're getting to seem really, really important. What I would like to do is ask Kevin to what extent you feel like you've heard information that would be useful in relation to your point about, trying to increase response rates, possibly going beyond some of the dimensions you raised about keeping the surveys short, making them multimodal, and so on. And then I'd like to ask you to sort of re-ask your question if there are still more things that you'd like to hear, and then allow the others to respond.
Sure, thanks. I think that, I mean, Christian, I'm disappointed that you got that third prosecutor and you didn't hire a data analyst instead, but I understand,
Yes.
you know, priorities. You know, I think it's a point well taken that this isn't just something that is, the solution isn't money. I mean, that's part of the solution, right? But it's also finding people, identifying staffing positions, but then also finding the people to fill those positions to help the offices. And I think I'm not supposed to answer a question with a question, but the point, Christian, you were making there kind of towards the end about kind of there's the need to have data elements, and there's the somebody else wants this data element because you're collecting data element. So I wondered if maybe, and I know that, you know, for example, just to take an example, there's an effort in the court space from the National Center again to build what are called the National Open Data Standards, which are kind of, these are the data elements that courts should collect, and further, this is how they should collect them. So they should collect the race of defendants this way, or you know, things like that. And I think the idea is kind of a stakeholder driven or consensus driven approach to kind of, these are the data elements that are common across courts and court systems that are of value to us. And so I wondered, you know, both for kind of the public defense providers, but also for the prosecutors, if that kind of effort might make sense, like identify a real core set of data elements. And then one of the things that there are two things that can happen. One is that there's, you know, resources, the TA, training and technical assistance, can kind of spring up around implementation of that. And the second is that when I come knocking on your door asking for your data, if there's a kind of a template or a standard that you've adopted, and I agree as the data requester to also adhere to that standard, maybe the idea is, you know, all you have to do is, you've got this extract that you push, okay, 3 buttons to run, but you push only a finite number of buttons to run, and you don't have to kind of go find the guy in the county IT department who can do a SQL query for you on your database. So I wonder if maybe kind of thinking through at least through administrative data, if kind of having a template might be helpful, or a standard, you know, these are the things you should be collecting. And then that list, in my mind, that list would not include aggravating or mitigating circumstances, for example. So just kind of a thought for maybe the panel to think through.
Well, I guess I would just respond to say, I think that, yeah, when we think about certain metrics, they can be collected through a strong centralized court system. If the court is already collecting that data, it's a logical place to do that. I think you're talking about some of the administrative sides, like let's say you wanted to ask about, you know, the level of experience of a line prosecutor, or some, you know, any variety of things. Those things would be uniquely situated for the prosecutor's office or the public defender's office to respond to. I think that the more notice that any office has about the nature of any collection, the better. No one likes that moment when it's January 1st and you get some survey and you say, well, we haven't collected this. I don't know how we would possibly respond to it. So I think if the more notice you give to any law enforcement agency, public defender service, prosecutor's office, I think the better. And I think one of your initial points is spot on, is that there is there is either data fatigue, there's a burden to it, and where in the stack on your desk is it falling? The shorter or more consistent that survey can be, I think the more likely you would be to get responses from rural offices.
Right. I think it's a great idea. I mean, standardization in general, it's, you know, especially if we're trying to, it's always going to be helpful, right? I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's a yes and scenario here. I think also, and going to I saw Travis's question about data fatigue and the idea of collection. I always find it's really helpful, especially when we're working with our defenders' offices in places that yeah, maybe they're slightly resistant, or maybe it's just a little bit more difficult to collect information, is really digging into like the why we're doing this. You know, we're not just collecting data for data's sake, right? And we need to use this information is being collected so that we can analyze it in a way so that we're making sure that the legal system and the defense system, or whatever system you're working in, you know, is actually, you know, you're providing effective assistance of counsel, or you're providing, you know, we're actually doing something. You know, we brought up, you know, tracking the races of ethnicities of people coming through the courthouse door. Well, why would we do that? Well, we do that so that we can make sure that our system is not, you know, leaning in a certain bias, or, you know, we're having sentences biasing, so things like that. And I think if there are to be standardized, you know, maybe it's data terms or collection processes or things like that, providing that information as to like why you want it this way, you know, will help the states, the counties, the local systems, all of the things below the federal government, you know, position, help people, I think, actually want to collect it in that manner as well. Plus, it also gets us all on the same page, right? I mean, we're all technically under one big U.S. Constitution, right? So it's, you know, there's you know, the U.S. Supreme Court case law that we should all be following in all of our states and our local entities and systems. So then we should be, you know, implementing our legal system and the justice in the same fashion. And that, I think that does help. You know, that's maybe, you know, the big broad way of thinking about it, but I you know, with standardization, having the explanation of why will always be very beneficial.
Right, and I can chime in also on that piece of it, Kristen. I think you're right, explaining how the data is going to be used. And we have a lot of internal conversations about giving the data back. And that's one of the things that when we write reports, we know that they're very lengthy reports and they're sent to our division of budget, or in the case of the settlement, sent to the plaintiffs. But we do use our data officer trainings as a means of bringing it back down to common language and showing. In April, we were asking you to help us collect this data. In June, we submitted this report, and here's what the report tells us about the implementation of the changes that we're making. Additionally, the data is used for us to see the sufficiency of the funding that's provided. $250 million is a lot of money. Is it enough? And so by reaching out and getting this data and being able to look at it over time, specifically the caseload data, and whether they're caseload compliance with our caseload standards, gives us the foundation to continue to advocate for additional funding. And so I think it is really important that we get that message out there. As to having a standardized system, I believe it's Measures for Justice that's working on coming up with some standard definitions or data elements that across all of police and prosecution and defense to use. And I do think that that's helpful. It's exactly what we're trying to do within our states, right? And you were saying that, Christian, making sure that everybody's collecting the same thing and having definitions and all of those things. And so I do think that the more familiar that provider offices, courts, et cetera, are getting with the need to collect on a consistent and annual or quarterly basis, and they can see the utility of it, I think they'd be more open to providing the information in any format that they could.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate that. And one thing that this is making me think about, and this isn't really intended to be pejorative observation, but that there is a kind of a tension here between the idea of, well, I wonder if there's a kind of a tension here between the idea of what you might think of as cookie cutter data collection, where as the in the center, you're looking for the same information everywhere. And you're constantly also contending with the idea that localities differ, which data ought to capture, but also that localities might differ in their ability to report. And also possibly localities might differ in the issues that are relevant to their justice systems. And one thing that one might inadvertently do by asking for uniform data from everywhere is somehow prioritize an issue that is only important in certain places, like urban places. I assume, Melissa and Kristen, that you have both had to contend with the question of, what data are the most important, and what data do we want to actually say everywhere has to provide. And so I'd like, at the risk of upsetting the apple cart, to actually ask Christian an open-ended question, which is, do you ever find that the cookie cutter nature of data requests from higher agencies somehow prioritize data that you know would be relevant to an urban place, but that don't capture the reality of something that's happening in your rural place? That's maybe a very specific existential moment. Maybe it's never happened, but I just wonder if that rings true at all.
Yeah, I don't know that it's so much happened in the data collection context, but it certainly has in sort of like continuing education or dealing with that with prosecutors or courts across the state. Is, you know, some of my rural colleagues and I will say that this has almost zero relevance to us. And you know, I understand that obviously the bulk of attention is going to be paid to the bulk of the population, but I absolutely would agree that when we're talking about, you know, if I'm going to a training about, you know, urban surveillance in a downtown area, it obviously has nothing to do with my the dynamics of or culture in a rural and homogenous community that I live in, largely homogenous, I should say. So I don't know that that's occurred in a data collection context, but broadly, I would agree. Yeah, that's something that rural prosecutors probably feel all the time when they're meeting with different coordinating councils or so forth.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. That really was that question wasn't planned. It just came to me, so I didn't know what you were going to say at all. Well, I mean, we're really at the end of our time here. I want to really extend my heartfelt thanks to everybody here, to Dr. Kevin Scott, to Christian Mash, to Kristen Staley, and to Melissa Mackey. This has been an extremely enriching discussion. I had the privilege of meeting with these panelists before this event and spending time with them discussing their specific challenges and thoughts about rural data collection. Certainly, I came into this thinking that it might be all about money, and that's why I was particularly taken aback by your observation, Kristen, that it certainly isn't. And so I've come away with a much more nuanced and rich understanding of these kinds of the issues surrounding this challenge. I hope that everybody in the audience has also found it to be equally enriching, and I'm sure everybody has. I also need to thank my colleagues at the center, Dr. Victorious Magaki, who's been collating questions and handing them to us. Mr. Travis Fink, we did see your question in the chat, and I know a couple of people alluded to it tangentially. I hope that you got some of the thoughts that you were hoping to get back. And Blaine Skiles, who organizes all of our publicity, and Joe Allen, who is the beating heart of the administration of our center. So thank you to everybody. I don't really have a closing thought, but Kevin, do you have anything that you'd like to close with?
No, I don't. I really don't. I thank you for inviting me, and thank you. I enjoyed listening, and I've been taking notes, and so I appreciate the opportunity to hear from all of you as well.
Absolutely. Well, if there are any final solutions that you think we haven't mentioned at all, Kristen, and Melissa, then please do pipe up. We covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with, any of you?
My closing thought, I think this reminds me of the Jerry Springer show, Jerry's final thought, is that we really, when we look at what metrics are collected, I forget who it was talking about the measure for justice metrics. The more we can standardize and have just a collectible data point, the better. And if that can be done in a centralized, to the degree possible, through a centralized court system, I think it makes it more realistic and more consistent to accomplish.
Well, amen to that. I'm sure everybody agrees. Thank you again all so very much. This video recording will be on YouTube in a couple of weeks or so, whenever we're able to get to it. And in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again to our panelists.